all of these and operate as a monopoly.
With his refining and distribution interests protected by the trust, Rockefeller set his sights on production. A golden opportunity soon presented itself. In the late 1880s, the Pennsylvania oil fields began to dry up. The center of the nation's oil production shifted west to newly discovered sources in Ohio and Indiana. The trust began buying up all the petroleum-rich properties it could get its hands on. By 1891, despite the fact that it had owned virtually no oil fields just a decade before, Standard now produced over 25% of the nation's total output of crude and refined nearly 90%. The nation was totally dependent on kerosene for light, and Standard controlled virtually every drop. It was simple supply and demand, and Rockefeller, for all intents and purposes, was the only supplier. Standard Oil seemed unstoppable. But on November 1st, 1879, the U.S. Patent Office awarded patent number 223898 to Thomas Edison. It was for the electric lamp. Edison found that his lighting system would be so cheap that only the wealthy could afford to burn candles. But of course, it was not the candle makers who had the most reason to be concerned. The light bulb took the country by storm and put the entire oil industry at risk.
Thomas Edison was just not an inventor, a scientist. He realized very quickly the commercial interest his invention would create. He priced his electricity to be competitive with oil. By 1892, an oil man, if he could sell a gallon of oil for 2 cents, he was considered pretty lucky.
As the 19th century came to a close, oil men feared for their future. But another invention soon appeared that filled them not with dread, but with hope. Henry Ford's automobile ran on an internal combustion engine powered by gasoline, a derivative of petroleum.
About the same time frame that most American homes were beginning to be electrified, the horseless carriage came along, the development of the internal combustion engine, and then the mass marketing of those so that every home could have an automobile, and they were all powered by gasoline, so one door opens when one door closes.
The automobile had saved Rockefeller's industry from oblivion. But another threat to the Rockefeller empire was emerging as the 20th century began. A new oil-producing region of the country being developed by a rough and tumble breed of men far removed from the Eastern establishment of John Rockefeller and Standard Oil. They were called wildcatters. As the 20th century began, the automobile was transforming the oil industry. Gasoline-powered vehicles promised to more than make up for the declining use of petroleum and kerosene production. Between 1900 and 1910, almost 500,000 cars took to America's roads. It was clear that new sources of petroleum would have to be found. Men began looking for the black gold in the most unlikely areas. One of these areas was Texas. The first gusher of Texas crude exploded from the ground on January 10, 1901. It was the largest strike in history, and it was a culmination of 2 years of struggle by a new breed of oilmen called wildcatters. It also marked the beginning of the end for Standard Oil's domination of the oil industry. The company now had to compete with thousands of oil men, probing and drilling the earth in search of oil. The stereotypical wildcatter was a man with little education who had a singular desire to strike it rich in oil. One such man was a one-armed merchant and Sunday school teacher named Patillo Higgins. Higgins was convinced that oil could be found at a site near Beaumont, Texas. On a small hill called Spindletop, flammable gas bubbled out of springs. Higgins felt that the gas was a sure indication of oil. However, practically everyone associated with the oil industry knew that oil fields were chiefly an eastern phenomenon. Expert geologists proclaimed the notion of oil in Beaumont ridiculous. Townspeople began to think that Higgins might be insane. All the experts agreed that Texas would never develop as a major oil-producing region.
In the late 19th century, the oil industry in the United States was primarily concentrated in a belt of states that surround the Great Lakes. Pennsylvania was, of course, where oil was first discovered in America. By the turn of the century, Ohio is the largest oil-producing state. The state of Texas, by comparison, is a relatively minor player.
In a desperate attempt to prove his theory, Higgins took out an ad for a professional driller. Only one, Anthony F. Lucas, a salt and sulfur driller by trade, responded. After listening to the Higgins story and examining the site for himself, Lucas became convinced that Higgins was not as crazy as people thought. Lucas and Higgins appealed to Standard Oil for help, but were summarily rejected. Desperate for funds, they then turned to the Pittsburgh-based wildcat firm of James Guffey and John Galley. The firm was financed by the Mellon family, who were among the nation's leading bankers.
Higgins had no money. He'd become a bit of a joke in Beaumont. Nobody was willing to put any money into anything that he put together any longer. Lucas started looking for more money, and a deal was worked out. Guffey and Galley would find the money. As it turns out, they went to the Mellon banking house, and the Mellon brothers gave a small percentage to Lucas, and they said nothing for Higgins. If Lucas wanted to share with Higgins, he could, out of the generosity of his heart, but they weren't willing to make a deal that would include Patillo Higgins.
Pushing Higgins aside, Lucas started drilling in the fall of 1900. After drilling down almost 900 feet, a trickle of oil bubbled to the surface. One of the experienced drillers on the crew speculated that the well might eventually produce 50 barrels a day. Most of the other drillers felt that this estimate was overly optimistic. Drilling continued into January. Each day, new pipe was added as the drill bored deeper and deeper into the Texas earth. On the 10th day of the new year, Spindletop began to shake. Then it erupted.
Spindletop is like no other oil find anywhere. It doubles the total U.S. production of oil by itself. It alone represents 1/5 of the oil supply of the world at that time. There is a lake of oil before they can shut down the gusher that is a mile long.
Land which had sold for $10 an acre a year before now went for $1 million an acre. Beaumont instantly became a boom town. Almost overnight, the city's population grew from 10,000 to 50,000. An additional 16,000 people crammed into tents on Spindletop itself.